Alright, so today we are testing the Radeon RX 6800 XT in Starfield. I almost said Cyberpunk. So we're pairing this GPU today with a 12700K CPU, and that's paired with the DDR4 4000 MHz CL18 memory. I say megahertz because that's what most people refer to it as, but the technically correct term is a mega transfers per second. Anyway, so we'll be testing at 1080p, 1440p, and 4K. I will put all the specs on the screen right now, but let's just go over the settings here quickly. I'll be playing firstly at 1080p. We're on the ultra preset, except I just disable motion blur because this game has very poor motion blur implementation. It's mostly pure in most games, but in this game it's just terrible. And then I just disable FSR, so 1080p native on the ultra preset, right? And there we go. So just for those of you who thought that I was serious with my thumbnail, I definitely am not. To get basically 60 frames per second with a 12700K and a 6800 XT at 1080p, that's terrible. Like, I know I said this is the perfect setup for 1080p, and it is if you want to maintain 60 frames per second, which is, I mean, it feels okay in this game. 60 frames per second, it does feel fine. Sorry if I'm making you nauseous, but obviously with these components you do expect something a little bit higher than this, but it does actually perform better than my 4070 Ti. The Radeon cards do perform better in Starfield for some reason. I'm not going to say it. You can draw your own conclusions. Let's just see if we actually drop down below 60 frames per second here when there's a little bit of combat. I do think we might, because we're pretty close, right? We're at 65, 64 frames per second every now and again. It hasn't dropped below 60 yet, so far so good. But once again, you'd expect a high refresh rate experience with these components, right? You can see our GPU usage. We are sitting at 96% usage. It's always in the high 90s, so it's not really CPU bottlenecked at this stage. If we do lower the graphical settings, you'll see the frame rate does increase, which means that it's definitely still GPU bound. It does become slightly CPU bound. I'm not going to argue that, depending on what's happening on the screen. But some areas we can actually get 165 frames per second as well. I mean, I have to enable VSync even at 1440p. This is a 165 hertz panel, so I have to enable VSync to stay within that range. In some areas, this is just a very this is the worst case scenario. Basically, this area is pretty demanding and unnecessarily so. Some areas do perform like this, others perform much better. All right, so I don't think it dropped below 60 frames per second there. Not that this hardware is you should be aiming for 60 frames per second, but it is what it is. But it does perform a little bit better at the lower presets, so let's just drop this down to high. Right, so we'll just drop this down to high over here. You'll see that the render resolution scale does decrease with the preset as well. So we'll go on to high, and we'll just disable FSR again and motion blur, and that's pretty much it, right? So 1080p on the high preset, and as you can see, I don't think we gained much. I saw previously we gain around 10% for each setting that we drop. For instance, if we drop from ultra to high, we'd gain 10%, and the average there, it might be a little bit higher. On the NVIDIA GPUs, it actually makes a big difference between ultra and high. For some reason, ultra is still a bit broken on NVIDIA GPUs, even after the latest update and drivers. The drivers actually added resizable bar support for this game, so you can see probably around 5 to 10% increase with an NVIDIA GPU, but ultra settings definitely are broken with the NVIDIA GPUs still at this time. All right, I think I killed pretty much everybody here, right? And well, that's it for 1080p high then. I'll have to reload my save because nobody else is coming. All right, let's drop this down to medium. All right, so we're on the medium preset, and we're not going to use 50% render resolution scale. That'll just look terrible at 1080p. So I'll just disable that and disable that, and then I'll just reload my save while we're at it. Right, we reloaded the save, and now we aren't really gaining much, and now we are definitely CPU bound. We were getting in the high 70s previously on the high preset. We're getting around, well, it's dipping below 70 there even. So, I mean, even though the GPU usage is sitting in the high 90s, you can see it's dropping down into the low 90s there as well. We didn't gain much in terms of frame rate, so that definitely indicates a CPU bottleneck. And it makes sense. I mean, this is a pretty powerful GPU. For those of you who don't know, the 6800 XT is pretty much on par with a RX 3080, faster in some games, slower in some games, but they're pretty much there. And for it to run at 1080p medium, it's a bit of a slap in the face, I do believe. So, I mean, it's definitely a pretty good experience. Not a high refresh rate experience, far from it. Not even averaging 80 frames per second here. And I mean, who's he shooting at? This is supposed to be my buddy, I think, or not. Anyway, so this is kind of pointless at this stage because we are CPU bound, and no amount of graphical settings tuning would get us a higher frame rate here. So this is pretty much what the CPU is capable of, and that's the highest we'll see in this specific area. All right, that's going to be it for 1080p. Let's move on to 1440p. Right, we're now at 1440p. We'll start off on the Ultra preset again, once again, just with the motion blur and FSR disabled. Motion blur just looks terrible in this game. FSR doesn't look much better, but that's the only option we've got here. So that's what we'll be sticking with. All right, so let's just reset our numbers here. And I mean, right off the bat, we're not getting 60 frames per second. So this will probably drop into the high 40s, I believe. I haven't tested this specific area with this GPU as yet, but I mean, the game does look okay. It definitely does not justify the performance. I don't mean that it looks okay in that regard, but going from 1080p to 1440p definitely makes a pretty big difference in this game. And it's a good resolution to play this game at. Just a pity that the performance is so terrible. I mean, these exact same settings with Cyberpunk 2077, which is in my opinion one of the better looking games even today. We're getting around 90 frames per second average. So I mean, depending on the area, it goes up and down, but it's definitely above 60 all the time without ray tracing. So this is just terrible. And I mean, this is not even a full open world. It loads in this one area, and you just have to traverse to another area. It loads that area in. So I'm not entirely sure why this game is so demanding. I'm not sure if it is purely because of the creation engine, or if this game is just not that well optimized. Don't ask Todd, though. He'll just tell you to upgrade your PC. But I'm not sure what kind of PC he's got in mind for 1440p gaming. I mean, this 6800 XT was touted for 4K gaming not too long ago, like a year ago. This was still fine for 4K 60. So I'm not sure. Anyway, the NPCs do disappear a lot quicker than they did the last time. I mean, nobody's fighting me. But we didn't get 60 frames per second. Now let's just enable FSR here a bit. I'm just going to... Where is it? Upscanning. Right, we'll just lower it to 80%. This is actually a pretty sweet spot. You can change your own, or you can set your own resolution scale. You don't have to use presets, which I think is quite okay. It might be a little bit confusing for those who aren't sure what the percentages are. And let's just reset our numbers. We didn't gain much. We went from 58 to 63, but it does seem to be a little bit more stable now. I mean, we are staying above 60 frames per second, it seems. But once again, there's not a lot of people there. So let me just reload the save and see if we can still maintain 60 frames per second here. Right, so I just reloaded my save, reset the numbers here, and I mean, we're like on the edge there of 60 frames per second. I'm pretty sure as soon as the NPCs will start running around, it'll drop down below 60. Not sure. There we go. So dropping below 60 there. Not that it's a big drop. I mean, it went to 57. It's just that you'd expect hardware like this to be able to do 60 frames per second consistently, right? And especially at these settings. Fortunately, that's not the case. Not going to be the end of the world if you're aiming for 60 and it drops to 57, for instance. It's just that this, as I said multiple times, the performance in this game is just atrocious. We can obviously lower the FSR even more. I don't think it's worth it. If we just go down to medium, it should be fine. Sorry, not medium. If we go down to high, it should be much better. There's not that big a difference in visual fidelity between ultra and high, but there is, as I said, around a 10% performance difference, and an additional 10% here should net us 60 frames per second all the time. Right, so let's just go back to native and drop the preset down to high and see if we can maintain that 60 frames per second at all times. Right, so just on the high preset, disabling FSR, and that's pretty much it. And let's see, so I mean, now where we were sitting just above 60, we're now sitting just above 70 in certain areas, and I do think we should be able to, I might be talking too soon, drop down to 61 there. So there might still be areas where you'll be seeing a drop below 60 frames per second. I do think there'll be less, there'll be few and far between. Once again, I'm definitely not condoning this performance here. I'm just, when I say the performance is okay or the graphics look okay, I'm talking relative in this game, or relative to this game. When compared to other games, the performance is definitely a lot worse. But as you can see, 1440p on the high preset is pretty much a solid 60 frames per second experience, right? Once again, terrible for this hardware, but that's just how it is, unfortunately. All right, so let's just reload my save again, drop it down to resolution scale of 80% and see what happens here. Right, so we're still on the high preset, just the render resolution scale is set to 80% here, and I'm just going to reload my save. Right, let's just reset the numbers, and it didn't gain much. So maybe we are CPU bound at this stage. I don't know, let's just see if we drop this down to 50%, if we do gain. So we gained a little bit. We went from, in this specific spot, 70 to 80. So we are definitely still GPU bound with the previous settings, but I think we are on the verge of becoming CPU bound. You can see that the GPU usage is still in the high 90s here. Well, okay, it drops down into the high 80s there, but as I showed you earlier, 80 frames per second is pretty much what the CPU is capable of in this specific area. So let's just go back to our 80% here, and I mean, we didn't see much of a performance increase here, right? But I do think we should now be able to stay above 60 frames per second at all times, unless we run into a CPU bottleneck, because you know, this game is so well optimized. That's sarcasm, by the way. So I think 1080p on the high preset with some FSR is okay. I mean, it's giving us an above 60 frames per second experience here. And once again, there are other areas that perform much better. Oops, I just shot my own buddy. There are some areas that perform much better. This is just the worst case scenario. I keep on repeating it, but I know people skip throughout these videos. They skip to timestamps, and so I'm just repeating it as we go along. All right, so high seems to be like almost the sweet spot for 1440p 60 gaming. It's terrible because on Cyberpunk I can get on 1440p medium I can get a high refresh rate experience, and Cyberpunk arguably looks a lot better than this. All right, so let's just drop down to medium at native quickly. All right, so now on the medium preset, just take note of that. You don't want 50% render resolution scale. That's just terrible. And all right, I think that's going to be it. And we're still in the 70s, yeah, right? So we should stay closer to 70 than we do to 60. I mean, that's what I'd expect. Whether that's going to be the reality, I'm not entirely sure. Right, so when it comes to this game, it's got its issues, right? There's a lot of bugs still. I read some reviews where people are saying that, you know, the early reviews, the game is pretty bug-free, and that's not been my experience. Twice I had game-breaking bugs where I had to reload a save because I got stuck or a sequence didn't happen. Sometimes when you've got to follow someone to a certain location before the quest starts, they'll just get stuck and they'll stand still there for no reason whatsoever. And NPCs are clipping through the ground and through surfaces, etc. Now, that's not the end of the world. The game-breaking bugs definitely are not ideal, but I'm having fun in this game nevertheless. I'm around 30 hours in, I think. I just finished the Crimson Fleet. I thought I killed you. I just finished the Crimson Fleet quest line. These cops are exactly like Cyberpunk, right? So that's why I keep on making that comparison. They just spawn wherever they want. So I'm definitely having luck. Where does he come from? They fall from here. All right, that's not like Cyberpunk then. I'm having a lot of fun in this game, actually. It's not a perfect game by any means. The fact that it's on Game Pass, that's where I got it. I actually have it on Steam as well, but I got it with the purchase of the RX 7600 GPU that I bought for the channel. I played on the Game Pass one because I got the early access version for that. So it's a good game. It's not the best. I don't think it's going to be winning any major Game of the Year awards, but it's not a terrible game. If they can resolve some of the game-breaking bugs and increase the performance or improve the performance substantially, then my opinion of this game will improve along with it. Do you think I can still talk to him for my quest? He's not interested. Alright, sorry guy. Alright, so that's it for 1440p medium. This is actually where I play the game. I play on medium high settings with a little bit of FSR. I set mine to 80% and a mixture between medium and high settings. And I mean, it's the best you can do, right? It's definitely not making full use of a 165 hertz panel, but I mean, what can you do? Alright, so let's see what happens at 4K. Alright, we're now at 4K on the Ultra preset, dynamic resolution off and upscaling off. So 4K Ultra native. Don't expect miracles here. I don't think it's going to go well. I'm expecting maybe 30 frames per second, but let's see what happens. And 30 frames per second it is. I mean, it looks like it's stuck at 37. If I look into the sky, we can maybe, there we go, 60 plus. Down here, 40 frames per second seems to be the way to go. I mean, sure, if you're targeting 4K 30, which the consoles are doing, but obviously with the major upscaling, then this would be fine for you. Most people would not like to play like this, especially on a pretty high-end PC. Just want to make sure that motion blur is disabled because there is a lot. There we go. Okay, motion blur was not disabled. So let's just reset our numbers here. Okay, now it looks a lot better. As I said, this game's motion blur implementation is just terrible. So getting to 40 frames per second to 4K native, it's better than I expected, but worse than what it should be. But as I said, what? Oh, what? Alright, sorry, let's just reset the numbers there because I think that messed with the 1% lows. You can see that the 1% and 0.1% lows are pretty close to the average, so it's at least a constant 30 frames per second experience. If you lock this to 30, you'd have a good experience, relatively speaking. This is just another thing about this game. The AI is just really stupid. Like, he's engaging and then he runs away and then he just does nothing afterwards. It happens quite often, especially in missions where you have to kill all enemies. Like, it can be such a drag because you have to literally go search for them. They don't come and attack you. Anyway, so 4K native. I mean, this is on the ultra preset, so I'm pretty sure if we drop it down to medium, we might get closer to 60 frames per second, and then we won't need to use very aggressive upscaling to get to 60. I think we'll have to test it out, obviously. Alright, so that's it for 4K native ultra. Let's just see what we actually need to do if you want to play on the ultra preset. What upscaling you need to use to get to 60 frames per second. Let's start with the 67%, which I do believe is quality, FSR quality. I might be wrong, don't quote me on this. And right, so 50 frames per second, so still not 60, obviously. And it's definitely feels much better than 35 frames per second, but it's still not a good experience in my opinion anyway. Once again, if you aim for 4K 30, sure, it's not going to bother you, but obviously with a high refresh rate monitor, you'd expect you'd want the frame rate to be quite a lot higher just to be able to make use of your monitor, right? Otherwise it's for naught. Right, let's see if we drop this down. Let's just go to 50% and reset our numbers. And I think we might stay close to that 60 frames per second number most of the time. Probably not all of the time. I think let's just reload the save and see what happens. Alright, so even with all these NPCs here, still around that 60 frames per second. I mean, sure, we are now rendering internally at 1080p. So, I mean, this is not close to native 4K at all, but that's pretty much what you can expect at Ultra, right? Alright, so before everybody just runs away again, let's just drop this down to high, and I mean, let's just get this back up to 100%. So we'll drop this to high and no FSR and definitely no motion blur. Alright, let's reset our numbers. And still in the 40s. So, I mean, at least it's not in the 30s anymore, but it's still a far cry from 60 frames per second. Personally, game like this, even though it's an RPG, it's a first-person shooter as well, and you do want at least 60 frames per second, especially if you're playing on a PC. That's my personal opinion, of course, and I mean, I know that's my friend, but there's nobody else with a gun to shoot, so I'm just shooting anybody. The AI is definitely not the best. It needs a lot of work, actually. Alright, so 40 frames per second is not going to cut it. Let's just see if we enable FSR. Yeah. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong one. Upscaling FSR, and let's just drop this down to 67% again. Reset our numbers, and look at that. Almost 60 frames per second. And I think this is actually pretty good, right? Because this is FSR quality. I mean, don't quote me on that. 67%, don't know what that means. But it doesn't look terrible, and it performs okay, relatively speaking, once again. Still dropping below 60 frames per second, obviously, as we could see there, but definitely better than at Ultra. So I think if we drop down to medium with these exact same FSR settings, we should be able to maintain 60 frames per second at all times, I think. So let's test that. Going to reload my save and drop down to medium. All right, so on the medium preset, 67%, just getting rid of a motion blur again. And let's reset our numbers, 65 frames per second. It'll probably drop below 60 frames per second, but at least it's above 60 most of the time. And I mean, it still looks pretty good. I mean, FSR at 67%, relatively speaking, once again. Let's just start some fights here and dropping below 60 again. So it doesn't look like you'll be able to maintain 60 frames per second with these settings, unfortunately. Are you New Atlantis or UC Security? I'm a bit confused here. Maybe a wanted system would be good in this game. The more cops you kill, the more they actually arrive. But I mean, I've actually seen some stealth missions where I get spotted, they start shooting at me, and I just hide. And it doesn't register then that you've been caught. You can complete the stealth mission successfully. So this game definitely still needs a lot of work. Alright, so I mean, if you want a close to 60 frames per second experience, then FSR at 67%. On the medium preset, 4K seems to be doing it. But let's just drop the FSR, let's just drop it to 50%. And now all of a sudden we're getting 80 frames per second. Okay, so once again, this is now back at 1080p, so it'll be pretty much like 1080p medium with a little bit of overhead. But FSR at 4K is definitely much better than FSR at 1080p, obviously, because it's upscaling from 1080p instead of 540p, so you've got a lot more information to work off of for the upscaler. I mean, the citizens are more brave than the security forces, it would seem. But this is okay, once again, relatively speaking, relative to this game's performance. I think if I had to play this game at 4K, this is where I would play it. Maybe just adjust the FSR scale slightly, maybe go up to maybe 60%, just to make it look a little bit better, though it's probably not going to make much of a difference. But you can see here we're getting 90 frames per second in this specific area. But 4K is definitely doable, right, if you don't mind aggressive upscaled settings. All right, so let's just do one last test. Let's just drop this down to low. Going to leave it at actually not, let's leave it at native, disable motion blur. Nothing else we can actually lower here. So all right, so getting around 50 frames per second at 4K low, so we should be able to get away with a much less aggressive upscaled setting here. Maybe 80% would net us 60 frames per second. If you don't mind playing on low and show the image it's very crisp, it'll just have a lot less detail. Alright, so let's just do that. Enable FSR and set the resolution scale to 80%. I do believe we'll hit 60 frames per second. Wow. I mean, 80% is really not doing much. You'd expect like a 20% increase in performance, but it's not that. You're getting around 10% increase in performance. So I mean, it's definitely not a linear scale. I wasn't expecting it to be. So this is just to give you an idea, right? So we should be able to get close to 60 frames per second most of the time. It's still dropping below 60 there and into the 50s there even. So let's just once again, let's put it on 67%. And this is pretty much as good as it's going to get at 4K. Sure, we can still adjust the FSR to 50%. I think it's worth it. We are getting a high enough frame rate for me to be okay with it. And the detail, I mean, it definitely looks pretty good at 4K. Once again, relatively speaking. Alright, so I think we've killed everybody. I'm not going to reload my save right now. As I said, maybe 4K medium with a little bit of FSR should do fine. I'm just testing low to give you an idea what the maximum frame rate is that you can get at 4K. Obviously, as I said, we can still adjust the FSR to 50%, but I don't think it's worth it. But that's just my opinion. Alright, that's going to be it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you in the next one.